So we move on now to joints. Articulations between bones. Joints that allow us to move the skeleton. Right? Our success as a species is largely based on the fact that we can move around. We're not planted in one place. We can hunt and forage for food. We wouldn't have nearly the success that we would if we were an immobile species. Movement is largely at the center of that success. And bones can't move themselves, right? Bones are rigid structures that provide support and scaffolding and a skeleton. You might have seen examples in lab of the different characteristics of bone, how the cartilaginous aspects of bone can still allow it to flex when you remove all the calcified extracellular matrix, but we don't have that in a free-living individual. Bones are rigid structures. So how do we move the skeleton? We can't flex bones specifically, but we can articulate between two points where bones meet. The objectives of this chapter: 1, identify the various joints in the body. Just like the various bones in the previous slide, the various joints in the body, they are classified structurally, they're classified functionally, and there are a few obvious major joints that we refer to a lot. My favorite is the shoulder joint, because that's the one that always breaks on me. You might have your own favorite joint. We will look at the structural and functional divisions of joints. The structural and functional divisions of joints. What does it mean when I say fibrous or cartilaginous or synovial joint? And you have a fast-forward leap ahead from this week's lab if you were there already. We'll also recap the types of movements that can occur at each joint. Using some nice models and examples, you can understand and see what a saddle joint is and why movement is as such at a saddle joint. It's not immediately obvious as you just picture it in your mind. When knowing the major types of joints, again, we'll come back to the candidate major joints in the body: knee joint, elbow joint, hip joint. Be able to locate and classify those pretty easily. What's not on here that I'm realizing now is an oversight on my part, is we're also introducing the idea of muscles and how muscles activate and execute movement at a joint. Bones by themselves, the skeleton by themselves, or itself, cannot move. Muscle needs to initiate that action. So we're going to talk about leverage. Matt had a great example in lab using the elastic. If you consider muscle as an elastic, the points of connection for that elastic will indicate where the muscle is shortening and help articulate how the joint moves. And that will really help in our discussion of specific muscles when we get there. So we're going to introduce the idea of not contraction. Contraction has its own section devoted to it, but the idea of muscle shortening and how shortening can affect movement at a joint. We're going to assume that muscles shorten because of contraction. We don't know what contraction is yet. We'll have a lot of time spent learning contraction. So I've probably already answered this question. What is a joint? It's a fun nod to our historical new legislation passed yesterday. What is a joint? Point of contact between two bones, or cartilage and bone, or teeth and bone. A joint is a point of contact between any of these two items: cartilage and bone, between two bones, or between teeth and bones. And even if you think of contact between two bones, in a lot of cases, even though the two bones are directly in contact, there might be some intervening cartilage in the middle. So it's mostly cartilage and bone. But there are some examples where two bones do directly contact. We'll talk about those today. And they are called an articulation or an arthrosis. Did I post these slides for those of you that... Oh, I'm so sorry. I actually am sorry. I meant to get these up before I came to class. They will be up. Please feel free to frantically scramble and write notes down, but they will be up. You will have this template. I apologize for not having this already for you to write with. Called an articulation or an arthrosis, the point of contact between two bones, cartilage bone, and teeth. The joints are classified in two ways, structurally or functionally. And each joint will have a structure and a function, if that makes sense. So structurally, is there a capsule? Is there a cavity that encompasses the joint? And what type of connective tissue is involved? How much connective tissue is there? It helps us to determine the range of motion at a joint and to classify them structurally. We'll get into examples. And functionally, how far does it move? The purpose of a joint is to allow movement. Some, lots, and actually there are joints that don't move at all. So I'll revise that statement. How much movement is there? And based on whether it's no, some, or lots, we can classify the joints functionally as well. Each joint will have a structure and a function. And often structure and function are matched. Structure really drives function. So structural divisions, building up first and foremost, fibrous joints. And an example is shown on the right-hand side here with the sutures that you saw in lab. Fibrous joints are those that do not have a capsule, they don't have a cavity. They are generally secured by dense, irregular connective tissue. The bones might be in direct contact, there might be intervening connective tissue, but they are generally secured to one another. And so the sutures shown here are a fantastic example. Dense connective tissue lining the serpentine walls between the two bones. And this is an immovable joint, but we'll talk about function coming up. Did those of you that have gone to lab already this week look at the exploded model of the skull and try to appreciate the sutures? No? You don't appreciate the sutures? They do a pretty good job of keeping the bones of your skull intact and in place and not moving. And just think, if you go back to lab and you see it again, just think of the surface area, right? The whole point of the suture is to increase the point of contacts between these two bones, to allow them to seal better. And not only do you have these meandering rivulets on the surface, but there's projections inside as well and underneath. Hold on a sec, I wonder. Can we see something similar? Yeah, we can. So you can see the projections on top and underneath, and even this is sort of glossed over. There's a lot more articulation in the actual bones that are in lab. So just fantastic how the body can maximize the surface area to seal the two bones together to provide a nice rigid surface. So sutures, dense fibrous connective tissue. A syndesmosis, and I can't say this word, or syndesmoses, the plural of syndesmosis, where a ligament crosses a space or connective tissue crosses a space. It's slightly more space than just two bones abutting one another. They might not be in direct contact, but a ligament will cross a space to essentially fuse the bones together. Again, allowing very little movement. the final example of a fibrous joint is what we call an interosseous membrane. And as you're learning in anatomy and physiology, the names give away the structure, give away the function. Interosseous membrane is simply a sheet, a connective tissue between two bones. Interosseous, between two bones. Membrane, a broad sheet of dense fibrous connective tissue. And we'll see an example of the interosseous membrane connecting the radius and the ulna. There's also one in the lower leg. Those are the two main interosseous membranes in the body. I'll show you those coming up. Cartilaginous joints. Not a syndesmosis, but a synchondrosis. Hyaline cartilage, no movement involved at this cartilaginous type joint. For example, the epiphyseal plate. We've seen this already. We know the epiphyseal plate. It's a cartilaginous joint. It's a line of cartilage or multiple layers of cartilage. You could argue it's not a joint because it's not an articulation between two bones. It's within a bone. But there is technically movement there, right? As the epiphyseal plate, the cells proliferate and grow. The bone itself moves, it extends. You could argue there's movement there. A true cartilaginous joint between two bones is what we call a symphysis. A symphysis. These only or usually occur on the midline of the body, and they allow very little movement. They try to seal bones together, but there's some flexion available. Think the vertebral column. The pelvis has a few as well to allow movement of the pelvis. We think of it as rigid, but it can flex. Anybody want to try their hand at naming the layers of the epiphyseal plate on the right-hand side? This is an epiphyseal plate. It's going to throw you off because there are 5 numbers and not 4. Anybody remember the layers of the epiphyseal plate? Or how about which side is bone and which side is cartilage? Let's think of it that way. Okay, we don't know that. What is, okay, defining characteristic? Large cells, right? Hypertrophic cartilage. Where would that be? I heard it down here. 3. Large cells, bigger than the rest. And you saw the stacked coins analogy? What does the stacked coins analogy refer to? She's got it. Someone else, though. Stacked coins, many cells, rapid dissolution? Are they dissolving? No. We did this in lab this week. We did this in lecture yesterday. Tuesday, not yesterday. I think it's probably even in the practices. And you probably know the answer to it, but you just don't want to offer the answer up. That's fine. Zone of proliferation, right? Proliferating cartilage. Resting cartilage, proliferating cartilage, hypertrophic cartilage, calcified cartilage, and this is bone. 5 is bone. So it's a bit confusing because we're including bone as one of the layers in this example. But I didn't put that number there. The website that I stole this from did. Used with permission. So you're going to remember resting, proliferating, hypertrophic, calcified. Those layers when you get to any quiz or final exam, correct? Yes, good. Thank you. I like that. Global ascent. All right, let's move on. Synovial joints, the last structural or last division based on structure. Synovial joints, one of the more common types of joints in the body where usually long bones, but also some short bones, articulate via their articular cartilage. The articular cartilage on the end of long bones allows articulation of these joints and movement through a wide range of motion. These joints are generally freely movable. The knee, the hip, the elbow, the shoulder. For some it's more movable than others. And we can see a nice example here of probably what joint? Probably the knee. I'd say that's the knee. Even without knowing the structure of the knee, it just looks like a knee. We'll learn the structure, not to worry. But it looks like a knee. So articular cartilage between two abutting long bones allows free movement with the help of a few accessory structures. And we'll talk about those accessory structures today as well. So these are the structural classifications. Fibrous, cartilaginous, synovial. Functional classifications based on how much movement is allowed. And there's a fair bit of repetition on this slide. If you were forward thinking as we discussed the structural classifications, you could imagine how the functional classifications would apply. Sutures are immovable, hopefully. They are an example of a synarthrosis. Multiple synarthroses are synarthroses. Shouldn't even try. Synarthroses. I'll show you examples on the next page of these two other types. Syndesmosis and a gomphosis. All of these do not allow movement. Anchored by their fibrous connective tissue to one another. Amphiarthroses allow some movement. They allow flexing, a little bit of torsion. Pubic symphysis, vertebral discs. Those are examples of amphiarthroses. What structural classification are those? In what big group? Cartilaginous, yeah, absolutely. And diarthroses are freely movable. Synovial joints are usually diarthrotic. Freely movable, a large range of motion. So every joint will have a structure and a function. Generally, the columns will parallel one another. Okay, the way that they're set up on the slide, they will parallel one another. Generally, fibrous joints are less or not movable. Cartilaginous joints, somewhat movable. Synovial joints, very movable. Generally, okay? So let's look a bit more in depth at some fibrous joints. We already know they lack a synovial cavity. Here the bones are held together by dense, fibrous connective tissue. We know there is little or no movement allowed at the joint. I probably shouldn't have gone into so much detail when articulating the classifications for you. It renders this slide less useful. But it's a nice way to look at the differences between the gomphoses, the syndesmoses, and the sutures. Little or no movement. We've already articulated what types of fibrous joints they are. Generally allow very little, if not any, movement. No, I won't jump ahead. So examples of these. We've talked at length about sutures, which are typically fixed. They don't start fixed, though. Most sutures are movable, and they become fused and immovable in the adult, but some of them are flexible in children during development. They tend to solidify in adults. Some more so than others. So even the frontal bone in your exploration of the skull this week in lab looked like one bone, the frontal bone, the front of the skull. And for our purposes it is, but it starts in development as two, and the sutures fuse. And over time they blend together, and you can't tell the difference between them. It is in effect one bone. Maxilla is another good example. It grows in two halves. You can still see the suture on the maxilla though. And you can separate it into left and right halves. If you trust the 3D depiction, you can see the suture, the remnant of the suture here between the two frontal bones. But for our purposes, it is one frontal bone. And you notice at the top of the slide, the suture is blended together and not even noticeable. What else? So the syndesmoses, there's a bit more space between the bones. The joint covers a larger area, a larger space. So the connective tissue, the fibrous connective tissue, or the ligament that connects those two parts of the joint is often longer. Syndesmosis, shown right here, the anterior tibiofibular ligament. There's very little movement, if any. There's some. There's very little movement at this joint. But the space between those, the space that the connective tissue covers, is larger. So the ligament is longer. But generally, the ligament keeps those two bones in contact, does not allow a lot of sliding or dislocation, a bit of rotation, but not much other movement. The only example of gomphoses in the body, which is another word for nail or bolt, is the teeth. The joint between the teeth. And what was that part of the mandible in lab that held the teeth? Something. Protuberance? No, that's not it. What was the name of that process of the mandible? Yeah, Matt. It's not the mandibular condyle, but that's close. Good effort. It's part of the mandible. It's more than everyone else is offering. What was the part of the mandible that held the teeth? Something process. There's another word for socket or pocket, but it's a scientific word. And we often confuse it with part of the lung. I'm fine with waiting for an answer. It might be uncomfortable for you, but I'm fine with it. Yeah, she's got the answer. Did you read that from your laptop? That's good. Okay, that's fine. She's resourceful. Absolutely. The alveolar process of the mandible. Alveoli, pockets, sockets, right? There are pockets in the bone that the teeth fit into, the alveolar process of the mandible. Labs are Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So I understand 1/5 of you have an excuse, perhaps, although you should have maybe read ahead. 1/5 of you are going to read the lab manual, and you'll remember this when you get to lab. And lastly, we have the interosseous membrane over on the right. It has the the prime role of helping to secure bones together. And this is an example that sort of bucks the trend. This is a fibrous joint that does allow some movement. And the interosseous membrane helps to define the range of motion, define the limits of movement. For here, the tibia and the fibula, but also for the radius and ulna in the arm. So you can see that sheet of dense irregular connective tissue holding the bones together. It always stays connected, helping to secure the tibia and the fibula. It might allow a little bit of torsion back and forth, but certainly if you consider the membrane in the between the radius and the ulna. And let's take a look at it. There we go. Nice interosseous membrane connecting the radius and the ulna. I really want to know what these things are sticking up, but we'll look at that later. Connecting the radius and the ulna, it's immovable. It's not rigid, but it's tense. It allows pronation and supination, limiting the degree of rotation possible as you pronate and supinate the arm. Interosseous membrane. Next, cartilaginous examples. We already know they lack a synovial cavity. And the spoiler is that synovial joints are the only ones with a synovial cavity. Two bones held together by not fibrous connective tissue, but cartilage, connective tissue, hyaline cartilage, what we call fibrocartilage, which is a bit more flexible. And that small degree of flexibility adds a bit more movement. Some are generally fused, but allow some flexing. We've talked about the examples already. You can see some over here on the right, cartilaginous joints, the symphyses, the vertebral discs, allowing flexion left and right, torsion. If I rotate my upper body left and right, clockwise, counterclockwise, flexion and extension, abduction and adduction. But we're jumping ahead. And the synchondroses, less movable, but that connect the ribs to the sternum. There's an example of one of these joints right at the point where your clavicle meets the sternum, or specifically the manubrium. But you can feel it on yourself right now. And you think that the sternum and the clavicle, generally they're fixed, right? They shouldn't move too much. But you can feel there's a little bump, and then a little groove, and then the sternum. And that seems pretty fixed until you try to move your arm in and out or up or down. And you can feel that small degree of movement at the clavicle. Small degree of movement. Should have recorded this. Nice example of the small degree of movement at a cartilaginous joint. What we just did was not this first example. There's one here between the first rib and the manubrium as well. It's below the clavicle. You have some muscle in the way, so you can't generally palpate that joint. We did the next best thing. These joints, the ones connecting the sternum to the ribs, generally immovable, largely hyaline cartilage. Some flexion, but they generally don't move too much. They expand and contract with breathing, but they have generally one resting form. The symphyses that we've talked about, you get a 2-for-1. Pubic symphysis on the right-hand side, where two halves of the pelvis meet, allows some flexion of the pelvis back and forth. And there are similar joints between the the ilii and the sacrum at the back that allow a slight bit of flexion, but overall fairly stable pelvis. Pelvis is fairly stable. Some fibrocartilage allowing some movement. And then we talked about the technicalities with the epiphyseal plate. It is still considered a cartilaginous joint. There is some movement, but it's within one bone. So we saw those examples. I'm going to wait till the clicking is down to a minimum. To me, that says that you're done writing down what's on the slide. The next set, synovial joints. What we think of when we think of joints are typically synovial joints. These have a synovial cavity, right? Only synovial joints have a synovial cavity. The example of the knee joint in the back is a nice example of a synovial joint. These bones covered in articulating cartilage. We know that from our last section. A nice smooth layer of articulating cartilage to reduce friction between the contact points so bone doesn't rub on bone and cause you unnecessary pain. Allows smooth movement through the range of motion. These joints have a cavity that contains a lubricating fluid called synovial fluid. And the two sides of the joint are held together, one, by the cavity. The capsule itself is largely fibrous connective tissue. And also ligaments, specific ordered ligaments that move across the joint to anchor in specific planes. And usually, that makes those joints very stable until you pull or strain or rupture an ACL or an MCL, or you dislocate your shoulder and rupture the fibrous capsule, which is the first time that I ever ruptured my shoulder, completely ripped the capsule open. You want to hear the story of how I first dislocated my shoulder? Did I tell it already? No? You care? Yeah? It was really dumb. In undergrad, as I was studying computer science initially, believe it or not, I thought, oh, I'll just go to the gym a lot. It was a good thing to go to the gym in undergrad. So my roommate and I would go in and we would do all of the presses, because the presses are the manliest exercises, and then we wouldn't do anything else. So we just did incline, decline, bench, some shoulder press. I told you, it's embarrassing. It's a pretty dumb story. So first ever dislocation, you imagine you do that for a while, think of the imbalance that you'll have. Strong, weak. Very first time I was doing this was at the gym doing shoulder press. And the old bench that we had, you would sit on the bench and the bar was racked behind you, and there was a long skeleton of the machine that went up. It was kind of at like 10 degrees back from vertical, 15 degrees back from vertical. It was just off of vertical, so you don't press right up. You kind of had to press back and then pull forward. So I pushed back and I'm up like this, and I decided to pull forward. And as I did, my pecs ruptured the shoulder cavity, ruptured the fibrous capsule. My shoulder popped forward, that's where I was pulling it, and then down. And I don't know how I re-racked the weight somehow, and then hobbled over to the desk, got an ambulance, went to the hospital, and got some fantastic painkillers. Not the way that you would ever like to spend an afternoon, and then any other class that you tell that story in afterwards, because fantastically embarrassing. Since then, hockey, swimming, hockey again, actually hockey 3 times, and mountain biking this summer. Kepic's got some really nice, we'll call them jumps, and if you don't hit them properly, you find yourself in a world of hurt, which I did. Permit a large range of motion. We know this already. So synovial joints look like they do in the back of this slide. Or if we provide a little bit more detail here between the phalanges of the finger, also a synovial joint, two bones covered with articular cartilage, encapsulated with synovial fluid in the middle. We can see the articular cartilage on the surfaces of each bone, allowing smooth, frictionless motion. The synovial membrane on the inside of the capsule contains the synovial fluid, or the lubricant, and the fibrous, irregular capsule on the outside keeps those bones together. This is actually an extension of the periosteum of the two bones within the joint. It extends over top, and the fibrous capsule holds the joint together. And that's the thing that I ruptured doing shoulder press. And that hurts. So fibrous capsule, irregular, dense connective tissue that keeps the joints together. We don't have any examples of ligaments here. There are ligaments that help keep this joint together, and they are projections of the muscle that comes down over top of the finger. So we've taken a frontal section through the bone and essentially cut off the top half of the bones and the muscle and the ligament, but there are ligaments that come over top as well that help to hold those bones together. And a number in the shoulder that are now ripped or deformed on me that we'll talk about when we get there. Let's call it for today. I'm embarrassed enough as it is. I hear all your snickers. You don't think I do, but I hear them. Have a fantastic Thursday. I'll see you tomorrow morning.